Hi students, here is the third narration for the nervous system and senses. And this narration will focus on the protection of the brain and spinal cord, so the protection of the central nervous system. So starting at slide 23 from the original batch and going to 27 with the reflex arc. And again, I'm hoping that by chunking the information, you will find it much, easier to digest some of this information. So looking at how the central nervous system is protected, I'm sure you're well aware that the cranium, the bony covering, the skull, covers the brain. It's a hard material, so obviously offering a lot of protection. There's also the scalp, and the spinal cord is protected by the vertebrae, which you already know. So I'm looking at this point here. And beneath that, there are three membranes called meninges. And I'm sure you've heard of the condition called meningitis, which is an inflammation of the meninges. And so the meninges, this is a membranous tissue, so much more delicate. And here we're actually looking at the dura mater, which is the uppermost layer of the three layers that makes up the meninges. And the word dura mater means tough mother, because that is actually the sort of tougher covering. Then there are two other layers beneath that. So in this image here, so a section is taken. You can see the scalp, you can see the periosteum from the bone, then the skull bone, the dura mater, something called the arachnoid mater, because it sort of looked like a cobweb kind of appearance. And that would be actually what you're seeing here, this strand-like structure. And then a very thin layer of something called the pia mater. And the pia mater is, little mother. So that's the lower layer. So we've got the dura mater, arachnoid mater, and the pia mater making up the membranous structures, the meninges that help to protect the brain. The other substance that helps to protect the brain is a fluid, cerebrospinal fluid. And cerebrospinal fluid flows in a particular pattern. You can, look on the internet and probably get a good video of how it flows. But it is derived from the plasma, the liquid portion of blood. And its function is to prevent really the brain from pressing up against the skull. So the brain actually floats in the skull because the fluid is present there. It also flows around the spinal cord, so you can find it around the spinal cord. You can do what is called a spinal tap, which is where you take a syringe and you go in between the vertebrae at a specific place and remove some cerebrospinal fluid. And sometimes that's done in medicine to then culture the fluid and see what kind of bacteria might be causing an infection. So cerebrospinal fluid has a particular pathway, the same way blood flows in a particular pathway around the body. CSF flows in a particular pathway, and it is derived from blood, as we will see. So this image here is meant to show you, that's what the arrows are showing you. And so let me read what is here. CSF circulates around the brain. It exchanges stuff with blood flowing in the brain. So the brain has an incredible supply of blood vessels bringing blood to it. And actually, when we sleep at night, most of the toxins are removed from our brain. It's one of the reasons why if we don't get enough sleep, the next day we feel really, like you're drunk or you're groggy or you can't really focus. You can't process information very well. You're not very alert. this is part of the reason. The CSF helps to protect and cushion the brain and spinal cord within the skull and vertebrae. So, this diagram, for example, is not going to be on the test. This is just for your general knowledge. You don't have to know the pathway. You don't have to learn all these different names. What I would tell you is that you see the word ventricle here. A ventricle is a cavity, and there are actually 4 ventricles in the brain. And the ventricles have special cells that also help with making cerebrospinal fluid. And I think that's all you really need to know. What is being shown here, sort of like a little horn, that's actually one of the ventricles. There's a 4th ventricle around here because this structure is the cerebellum, right, the little brain. This, of course, is the brain stem here. So this is a good sagittal section of the brain, and you can again see the gyri, the folding of the brain, and the CSF is flowing in what seems to be like a little space here, and it's flowing around. And these areas that you see sort of going up there, that's where it can connect with some blood vessels and actually, have a bit of an exchange happening. Next slide deals with the cross section of a spinal cord. Now this diagram you'll find on the lab, and this you might also find on the test. So this one you do have to know. So let's go through the labeling of it. It's mostly about labeling. So this central canal here, this little opening, that's actually where you also have CSF flowing through. But more importantly, the cross-section of a spinal cord, very easy to recognize because you will often see this structure which looks like a butterfly. Some people say an H, but I would probably use more of a description of a butterfly. And that is gray matter, as you can see there. It is gray matter. So we can separate gray matter from white matter because everything else is white matter. If it isn't gray matter, then it's white matter. So hence, this is white matter. The cross-section of the spinal cord shows the posterior back, anterior, which means front, and lateral side, horns or roots. So we have a posterior column and a posterior horn here with the gray matter. I'm more concerned with whether you can distinguish the butterfly, which is the gray matter, from the white matter, and the central canal. This is what you should know. So this is a cross section. So it's important that you realize that some of these images are showing a sagittal section of the brain or a cross section, in this case, of the spinal cord. So this is saying that the spinal cord looks like this, and a cross section means you've cut across and you're looking at the face of what you can see because you've cut it. So this is the spinal cord here showing its organization with the vertebrae. And emerging from the spinal cord is a spinal nerve. So sometimes you hear people talk about a pinched nerve. What has happened is this nerve here is somehow being, let's take this one, it's somehow being squished between the vertebrae. Why? Because this here, this structure called intervertebral disc, this is a nice padding of cartilage. So I might have mentioned this when we were talking about cartilage in the skeletal system. So at the ends of long bones, we had hyaline cartilage. Here we've got fibrocartilage. This one is a little bit more, it's a stronger cartilage, has a lot more collagen in it. And it's because when we move around, our spinal column moves. And we never want bone rubbing against bone, right? These two bones should never really be rubbing and touching each other because they would erode over time. But sometimes, depending on people's activities, true life, etc., This can happen, that the cartilage is just worn out, and then when that happens, sometimes the nerve gets pinched. So this here, this image will not be testable, but this one will be, yes. So the gray matter takes on the butterfly shape. Of course, we know gray matter is unmyelinated neurons, so mostly cell bodies, while the white matter glistens. So notice that the arrangement is different here. In the brain, when we were looking at the brain, the white matter was on the inner portion, and the cerebral cortex on the outside was gray matter. Now gray matter is on the inner portion. So just make a note of that. The spinal cord is essential in reflexes, which we're going to look at next, because we find a specific type of neuron called an interneuron. So an interneuron is a neuron that takes messages from a sensory neuron to a motor neuron. Sensory neurons are neurons that send information to the spinal cord, which then can go to the brain. Motor neurons bring impulses away from the brain or from the spinal cord. So if we look at this, this would be the image here of a reflex arc. This will help you to understand the terms I was just using there. So here we have the pathway of a reflex arc. So here you can see the cross-section of the spinal cord. The green neuron, this little one here, that's the interneuron. And as you can see, it's taking information from one neuron, this one, to this one, the one in blue. So let's follow the pathway. So this is an image here, a cross-section. This is showing you the skin and a pin, which is the stimulus, poking the skin. So we all have experienced this. We know that we will feel, the sharpness of the pin. What we have in our skin are receptors. This is a word you need to learn if you don't know it yet. Receptors detect the stimulus. That's their job. That's what they do. A receptor detects stimulus. So again, like I said before, we have receptors for pain, we have receptors for touch, light touch, deep touch, etc. And those receptors actually have names. In a higher level anatomy and physiology course, you would have to learn the names of the different types of receptors. So the receptor would then detect basically the change that has occurred in the skin, which is the pin poking it, and the receptor transmits that information to a sensory neuron, not a motor neuron, never a motor neuron. Why? Because a sensory neuron, that's the name given to a neuron that takes information to the central nervous system, in this case the spinal cord. So for a reflex, what is a reflex then? Reflexes are pre-programmed, automatic, very rapid responses. We're born with them. And they usually do not involve the brain right away because they need to be quick. They're usually a response to danger, for example. So if I walked up to you and I put my hand in front of your eyes, you would start to blink, usually, or you would close your eyes. That's actually called a blink reflex. So we have many reflexes, and inside our body we also have reflexes happening that we're kind of unaware of. Now, a sensory neuron looks a little bit different from the neuron that you studied in the first narration. The neuron that you studied in the first narration looks like this one in blue, where you had the cell body with the dendrites and an axon that is very long and that ends in an axon terminal. And here, the axon is basically an axon terminal. It's going to send the impulse to a muscle. A sensory neuron has a slightly different arrangement where the cell body is roughly kind of halfway along the axon. You don't have to know why or any more other than that. But what it does explain is when you look at the structure, you always see this bulge here. And that bulge tells you that this is the dorsal root ganglion because there's a ventral root. Not ganglion, just ventral root. What's a ganglion? A ganglion is a collection of cell bodies outside of the central nervous system. So because a sensory neuron has its cell body sort of halfway along the axon, then this collection of cell bodies here is what's referred to as the ganglion, and this is on the dorsal side. Ventral is belly side, so this is on the dorsal side. So this structure here is the dorsal root ganglion, and this is a sensory neuron. So the sensory neuron has a synapse right here with the interneuron. So the information is transmitted to the interneuron. Notice that all of this is happening inside the gray matter of the spinal cord. So the interneuron passes that information. There's another synapse here to the motor neuron. So motor neuron takes information away from the central nervous system. So there's our motor neuron taking the information to the effector. So the effector is the muscle or the gland that actually carries out whatever effect it is that's going to keep you safe. There's some reflexes where the effector may be a gland that has to secrete something on the inside of the body. But in this example that we've given you here, we're giving you an example that you're reasonably familiar with so that you can relate to it. So when you touch a hot or sharp surface, sensory receptors of the skin send impulses along sensory neurons of the afferent pathway. Afferent is a word you should learn, and the opposite word is efferent. Efferent is like exit. So anytime you hear the word afferent, it means towards something. In this case, afferent pathway is towards the spinal cord. Sensory neurons lead to the spinal cord through the dorsal root ganglion. Here the signal is passed to an interneuron. So interneurons are only found within the central nervous system. They are not found in the peripheral nervous system. So an interneuron then passes, it's like a relay neuron. So it passes that information or signal to the motor neuron. And the motor neuron will exit the spinal cord through the ventral root of the efferent pathway that will eventually connect to a skeletal muscle, telling it to contract and lift your hand from the hot or sharp surface. So that takes me to the end of this narration. Now there was a slide before this one that I passed, so unfortunately when I'm recording I can't go backwards. So I'm going to ask you to make sure you also include that in your studies. Take care.